I don't think this story was meant to be about God. Maybe at first, a little, but not more than it was about anything else. It was just as much about God as it was about the pewter cross itself, the one hanging from my father's metal chain. He said he hadn't worn it since high school, but I guess I could borrow it if I wanted to. He asked me why I wanted to, seeing as I wasn't raised any kind of religious. I wasn't quite sure what the answer was. People will make assumptions, he said. I said, it's pretty. I mean, maybe the story was just as much about God as it was about the fact my uncle wouldn't enter a church. He's a communist, apparently, though these days maybe I shouldn't say that out loud. I asked him why, and he said churches have caused too much harm. They hurt people. They save people too, I think, but he's a communist. I think misplaced ideals are not foreign to him. I think it was just as much about God as it was about the fact I couldn't understand why when I crossed myself I'd feel the weight of each gesture land heavy on my chest. I think the story was meant to be about the fact that I'm an atheist. Sometimes, mostly. And I resent the term agnostic because why not just decide? Tolstoy said he doesn't believe in God, but likes the version of the world with an idea of God better than the one without, and so he chooses his faith over his logic. John Fosse said it didn't matter. We could believe in God or we could not. It won't really make a difference to his material existence. Ada Limon said she couldn't pray to God. She didn't believe in him like that, so she prayed instead to the rivers. She said she believed in this connection we all have to nature, to each other, to the universe. And when her friend said, yeah, God, she wrote about looking up at the unruly sky, its clouds and simple animal shapes we could name, even though we knew they were really just clouds. Marvelous, disorderly, and ours. My friend Anne says she sees God in the eyes of the trees, in the eyes of the deer or a tree in the sunlight. I told her I see art in the eyes of the deer, or a tree in the sunlight, or the moment you see awe in the eyes of children or lovers. And maybe art is what I was chasing all along. The city was certainly full of it, from the consumable to the non. At La Place du Tertre, the popular tourist square up the street from my cousin's apartment, you could pay a man 20 euros for a 10-minute portrait. Streets were lined with museums, the big ones like l'Orsay and l'Orangerie, and of course the Louvre, but also the ones that were converted studio run by an underground artist, or a group tour, a group show on touring exhibition. A city full of art is a city full of artists. I met one at Le Jardin du Luxembourg when I took a wrong turn and ended up at the last night of a 2-month pop-up exhibit. The painter, a middle-aged Danish man who offered me half his rye and Swiss sandwich, sat on a bench and told me how he'd started in finance and then got lost in his 20s. He said he found himself in a landscape painting at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. He saw it turning a corner at the end of the hall, and suddenly he got it, he said. The light, the composition, everything. He's been painting now 25 years. Maybe that's a bit like how I started this story, thinking I was looking for God, but really I was looking for art and experience and a reason to stay alive. And if you spent 2 months alone in Paris, maybe you'd learn a bit what I did. Maybe you'd learn that more than chiasmus and technical skill, Canova's psyche, revived by Cupid's kiss, psyché ranimée par le baiser de l'amour, took you 2 hours to drink in, because there was something ineffably poignant about the way the sculpted girl's hand clung to Eris's shoulder and how she fell so softly into what looked like liquid fabric but was really just marble. Maybe you also learned that you can go 5 days without speaking a single word to anyone, and that maybe you could have gone more if you didn't get scared by this fact and force yourself into a jazz bar you'd never been in before, La Cave de la Huchette in the 5e arrondissement, and you ran into 2 drunk American boys who wanted to buy you a drink, and maybe you told them, I don't speak English very well, which wasn't true, but was a line you learned to sell, and then maybe once you start talking, you'll realize you didn't have to stop. Or maybe you learn that even though you can go 2 days worth of meals on a single tomate mozza sandwich, maybe you really shouldn't. Maybe you'd learn that every other passerby fancies himself an amateur street photographer, and every one of them desperately wants to show you their black and white film-developed shots. You might learn that so some are better than others if you nod gravely and tell them the composition is stunning and the pose they caught so evocative, like a whole story has been captured. They'll feel like you understand how special their work is. Men like to feel special. I don't know, maybe you learn that there isn't a point to sitting in the tree-lined square outside the Sainte-Hélène Cathedral, watching Parisians on their lunch break smoke cigarettes and pondering if you've ever really felt like yourself or an adult or what either of those things really mean. Maybe when you sat in the pews, you bent your head down to pray and you realized the air felt lighter here than it did in Italian churches, which were thick and heavy with sickly sweet incense, or Greek churches, which were dry and filled with the smoke of just burnt candles, always. Maybe you couldn't tell if the God was different or the people were. And maybe you remembered that France has a history of faking secularity, and maybe you wondered if you really were of your people, because why did the gold-paneled frames and imposing concrete columns make you cry? Was that not all at God? Or are you moved by architecture? That seemed silly, you'd conceded, and so you'd bent your head down, forehead against the back of the wooden pew before you, knees digging into the floor, and you pressed between your hands a small souvenir coin of the Madonna you'd bought at a flea market in Athens, and you'd hoped for proof of something real. And you wondered if you were talking to yourself there in the empty cathedral, and you crossed yourself anyway, because that's what one does. And you thought of your father and the fact he said people would make assumptions, and how could they not assume that you believe in God, bent over a wooden pew in an empty white chapel? But maybe you were seeing yourself as from the outside, short curls still drenched from the rain, head down, eyes closed, knees on the ground, quietly mouthing words unintelligible to yourself. It feels so far from the point to say that this was about God. Wasn't it about the old Egyptian man who worked the vintage postcard kiosk and the falafel he bought you for dinner and the 20 euros he pressed into your hand to help him pack up the heavy film camera gear? Wasn't it about his trip to Budapest and his chain smoking and the way he stopped every passerby for a conversation and pulled up a stool beside him and how you sat with him for hours as he told stories about his restaurants, his travels, his girlfriends, his photographs? And now he told you that you seemed to know who you were, and you didn't know how to take that because such an assertion had never felt so wrong. Wasn't it about the cluttered backroom apartment of the woman who owned the cultural center? Here at least you could say you saw God, in the postcards of gold idols and small wood-carved Santos and the poses of the Madonna that you could now name and identify from your courses at l'École du Louvre. She talked about him, too, the same way she talked about Simone Weil, whose text you'd read, or Denise McMara, whose text you hadn't read, but she lent you, a heavy book of pictures and texts on the sacred architectures of holy spaces. Maybe God was what the painter from the Congo meant when he said there was a universal consciousness we could all tap into, or not, and now he played the piano with no lessons, simply by listening and feeling. Maybe when you sat down to play next to him, that's what you meant, or maybe you were just saying thank you for the cantaloupe, which he'd bought that morning at the farmer's market, and which always tasted better in French Julys, sweet like honey, a flavor with rounded edges. I don't know. Because what isn't this about? God? Mainly? Mostly? I ran out of time to find out if he was real, or whether it mattered. I was too busy trying to understand what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to live alone for the first time in a city I desperately wanted to call home. Do I believe? Depends on the day. Most days, no. But earlier, I walked in the woods and cursed God aloud, and then my sandal slipped on a wet log, and I caught myself and looked up at the sky and said, fair enough. But maybe what I was talking to was just the birds and the trees, lit golden on the edges by sunlight, and the clouds, and simple animal shapes I could name, though I knew they were really just clouds, disorderly, marvelous, and ours.